Yes, yes, yes. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, yes, yes. I am Mary Magdalene, and I am here to welcome you to the love that you are. I am also here because I have been asked to tell you a bedtime story. And I have a wonderful story for you called The Haves and the Have-Nots. This story takes place in a kingdom that existed on your planet, Earth, a long, long time ago. In the kingdom, there were, of course, the royals, the king, the queen, princes, princesses, lords, dukes, and there were the noble people, the landowners, the ones who had no royal blood, but they amassed great wealth, power, influence, and of course, had land where they raised lots of animals and where they had peasants working the fields to grow the food and tend to those animals. The peasants were the have-nots, and everyone else in this kingdom were the haves. The peasants lived in the forest. They built huts for themselves. They lived off of wild game, berries, roots, whatever they could find. And they would work for the noble people and the royals when the royals would hire them. But mostly they lived on the outskirts of their own society because they didn't have any land to inherit, any wealth to inherit, any homes or animals. they didn't have any weapons either. They depended on the kingdom to keep them safe from barbarians, from others who would want to claim all of that land that they lived on the outskirts of for themselves. And the rich haves needed the peasants to do the work they didn't want to do, work they felt was beneath them. They took pride in how pale their skin was for never having to toil in the fields, and how beautiful their hands were, never getting them dirty, never having to milk a cow. Or put a horseshoe on a horse. Now, the peasants were living close to nature and had a greater sense of community than the haves. Because they lived closer to one another, and because they had to forage and hunt, they knew the wind, the sun, the hills, the trees. They knew it all very well. The haves didn't have that same sense of community. They were very concerned with their wealth and their status, and the vast amount of land that they owned kept them separate from each other. Their neighbors could be a very long ways away. And as I said, they didn't care for getting their hands dirty. So they were separate from the earth as well. They were not nearly as happy as the have-nots assumed they were. They had the comfort and the security. They always knew there would be enough food for their bellies and silks to cover their skin. But they didn't know whether someone else was going to turn on them because they were jealous or because they wanted the same status as, say, a duke had. Another advantage the have-nots had was because they didn't have as many forms of entertainment, many of them spent time in what they would call prayer, but what was really meditation. And one day, one of the younger men, named Oscar, was meditating while sitting under a tree by a brook in the forest. And all of a sudden, he had access to the Akashic records. He could see his past lives. he could see the past lives of the people he knew in his community. And he went into some of those past lives for greater detail. He discovered that everyone in his community had once been a have, had once lived in great wealth, opulence. Some of them even had royal status in the great history that he was able to perceive. Oscar was also able to see how it wasn't always so pleasant to be a have, how lonely some of those lifetimes were. The loss that would occur to certain noble people that he had been and that others in his community had been in these past lives. How they had no way of coping in the world without their wealth, no skills, no ability to build their own home, to hunt, to forage. Oscar felt all of this compassion within him for not only those versions of himself and those in his community who had been haves in the past, but he also felt great compassion for the haves in the present lifetime, in the kingdom in which he was a part and everyone in his community was a part. Oscar told everyone in his community about what he had seen, what he had tapped into. He explained what these records were. He explained what he had seen, and when he would tell stories to individual members of the community about their past lives, some of them would burst into tears. They would exclaim, "That would be why I'm so afraid of drowning. That would be why I'm so afraid of fire. That would be why I'm so afraid of losing my loved ones or what little possessions I have, including my home." Again and again, members of this community were told of their past lives by Oscar and wept and came to these conclusions about where their fears came from and also where some of their gifts and abilities came from, as Oscar was also able to see those lifetimes where they had gifts, where they could heal others, where they were shaman, where they had abilities like an oracle, a psychic, an intuitive. Even some were channels. The people became fascinated by Oscar and his stories. And they also began to see the haves differently. They knew that the haves were just them in different form, just them from the past, playing out this scenario with them now so that they could have a balance of experiences. They also knew that they would be the haves again one day in other lifetimes. And it allowed them to relax. It allowed them to release all of their resentment, of others, all of their pity for themselves, they were able to live in greater harmony with inner peace. And those who worked for haves would smile more at them, would attempt to have conversations with them about their feelings, whether they felt lonely or isolated, because they understood that the lives of the haves were not as glorious as they seemed from a distance or even while working in their homes. If one of the peasants who worked for the haves could sense there was discord in the home between family members, they would offer up a story of something that was going on in their community that was similar. They wouldn't dare ask the noble person to confide in them about the troubles they were having in their familial relationships, but they found clever ways of giving little parables to these noble people so that they would understand how much they were alike, how the peasants, the have-nots who lived in the forest had the same troubles and had to find solutions to the same issues and problems. And soon the noble people and even some of the royals began really bonding with the have-nots and seeing them as extensions of their own families. They did begin to confide and talk about their feelings, their relationships, the issues they were having with their own finances, debts they had accrued, problems with the crops and how that affected their bottom line, taxes they had to pay to the king and queen and how that affected them. And this was something that the have-nots were completely unaware of. No one ever came into the forest and asked them to pay taxes for anything. They never had to worry about crops or debts. No one would ever loan them money. It wasn't long before the have-nots realized that they were living a better life than the noble people and the royals. And they began to want to help in other ways. And so they would reach out and invite some of their bosses, their employers, to come into the forest and celebrate the solstice with them or celebrate a full moon with them. The noble people were astonished at how happy these peasants, these have-nots were, how they could dance around a bonfire for hours and hours singing, how clever they were in the way they could make their own homes and create their own wine. What amazing marksmen and markswomen they were with a bow and arrow, and how the roast pig would taste so much sweeter because it wasn't farmed, it was wild. It was able to eat what came naturally to its diet. Soon the noble people began to spread the word about these peasants and what beautiful lives they were living, how much fun they were to be around. And suddenly more and more of the haves wanted to have a peasant in their lives, wanted to have someone to talk to, someone to invite them to these parties and these little gatherings and dinners that the have-nots would put on when there was a particularly bountiful foraging or hunt. And the entire kingdom began to become more unified. The word of this unity spread to the king, and the king did not like it. The king and the queen felt threatened. The princes and the princesses wanted to be a part of this world of the have-nots, but didn't feel like they could because of their parents and the way their parents felt about the have-nots and the threat that this unity posed to the entire kingdom. And so they kept their mouths shut, but occasionally they would dress up in tattered clothing and go and visit the forest, pretending they were traveling through from another land. And after a while, the have-nots caught on. They realized that these people were royals posing as peasants, wanting to get in on their experience. And so they never said anything, never called them prince or princess, but went along with it and allowed them to join in their festivities, their celebrations. The princes especially felt so grateful for this opportunity, and because they had been given access to some of the wealth of the kingdom, they would occasionally give gifts, rubies and sapphires, other valuable stones, silks even, to the peasants, and the peasants would be so grateful to receive. They were so happy to have anything. They didn't really understand the concept of money, but they understood that these stones were pretty. They understood that they could make comfortable clothing and socks and underwear out of the silks. They didn't want to be seen wearing silks, of course, because they might be accused of stealing it. The king became even more paranoid and worried about this alliance. He did not know that his sons and daughters were slipping off into the forest at night. But he did know that if there was a sense of unity within his kingdom, that they might feel eventually they didn't need a king or a queen or to be governed at all, because they could just share with one another their skills, their abundance. And this was very, very upsetting to the king. He didn't know what to do to stop this from happening, but he knew he had to do something. One day he created a law that said that you had to have a reason to go into the forest, and that people who lived in the forest could only go to the homes of the nobles and the royals if they had work papers to do so. He had his enormous staff build a wall between the forest and the rest of the kingdom. And he also decreed that anyone who was caught disobeying this law would be imprisoned. All the people of the kingdom were outraged. They did not see how any of this affected the king in any way, especially not in a negative way. Some of them knew the king personally and would plead with him to let things be as they were, to let them commingle with the have-nots. And the king was not one who could be easily persuaded, and neither was the queen. So when attempts were made to get her to change his mind, they fell on deaf ears. People of the kingdom knew better than to try to overthrow their powerful ruler. They had no interest in doing so. The people in the forest, the have-nots, were sad that they were cut off from their new friends, but they still enjoyed their lives. They still had plenty that they could do to enjoy themselves. It was really the noble people and royals that lived outside of the king's castle that were particularly upset by this new decree, this new law. They went back to living lives of boredom and isolation, with their worries and discontent in their relationships. They would be granted papers to have workers come in, and oftentimes when the peasants would be allowed to work in the house of a noble or royal, they would just be fed and they would talk about the good old days. They would share their stories. The haves would talk about their problems again, with so much compassion coming from the have-nots that worked for them, working more as counselors than cleaners and farmers. The king continued to live his lifestyle, which was very sedentary. He did not exercise. He overate, he drank, drinking away his fears, his worries, his anxieties. One day, all of this caught up to him, and he had a heart attack and died. His eldest son, Jonathan, took the throne, and Jonathan was one of the princes who so enjoyed being with the have-nots. Jonathan did more than just tear down the wall. He did more than just tear up the decree and release all the prisoners who had been caught crossing the border illegally. He sought to unify everyone in the kingdom. He created festivals, fairs, bazaars, balls, everything that he could, and sent his men into the forest with invitations to all the have-nots to these events. And the have-nots would bring their revelry, their berries and soups and roast pigs that they would catch and prepare just for these special occasions. They were given the opportunity to take baths, to have new clothes, and to frolic with their old friends. Some of them made new friends, as well as the entire class system crumbled. If someone was called Lord or Duke, they didn't insist on being called that by one of the have-nots. The princesses and the other princes all had regular first names that they insisted to be called by. Now, the queen was very upset by all of this. She didn't like it at all, didn't think that it honored her husband, the king who had passed, that it was defiant, that it was chaotic, and that it would lead to anarchy. And she struggled and struggled so much with coming to terms with it. She got together with a secret faction of other haves who felt the same way, didn't like these dirty peasants coming into the kingdom to enjoy the same luxuries that they enjoyed. And so they started a group that aimed to separate once again. They had plans, ruthless plans, like burning down the forest, like overthrowing the new king. And the darker and darker they went with their plans, the sicker the queen got. She got so sick, in fact, that she was bedridden, could no longer attend the meetings of this faction. None of the royal physicians could help her. One of the princesses was very close with her mother and had so much sympathy for her, even though she could see the dark path the queen was going down. Her name was Alice. She insisted all of the have-nots call her Alice and not princess. And so Alice went into the forest and told of the sickness of the queen. The shaman of the community, a very elderly woman, stepped up, gathered together her herbs and potions, and followed Alice into the castle. The queen, completely unaware that she was being tended to, that she was being given these elixirs, having these ointments rubbed on her, and being given love. As the shaman would place her hands on the queen's head and other parts of her body, loving her unconditionally, forgiving her, washing all of that darkness out of her energy field. And one day the queen arose from bed, and Alice was there waiting, with a big smile on her face. Alice told her the whole story of what had happened to her and how she had been healed. The queen was beside herself. She couldn't believe that she was so narrow-minded, that she had ever wanted there to be separation between the groups, the haves and the have-nots. And so, at the next faction meeting, the first one she could attend in a long time, she disbanded it. She made it illegal for people to meet in that way with any sort of agenda to separate and to divide. And she asked for her family's forgiveness. She still had a status in the kingdom. She gave a great speech about unity, about forgiveness, and about healing. And the kingdom flourished from then on. Most people were well and happy. They played and they shared, and they got to know each other. There was no separation, there was no classism anymore, and everyone lived happily ever after. The end. I am Mary Magdalene, and I hope you liked my story. Good night.